General Hospital spoilers tease that the air in Port Charles had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. Like the quiet before a storm when the wind holds its breath and every shadow seems heavier than the last. But then came the thunder, sudden, undeniable, and world-shattering, when Lucas stepped forward and shattered the silence with a truth no one wanted to believe. With a voice steadied not by courage but by the weight of unbearable grief, Lucas revealed what many had whispered in fear but never dared to say aloud: Sonny Corinthos was connected to the death of Natalia Ramirez. That revelation, spoken not as conjecture but as a claim grounded in personal knowledge and emotional conviction, tore through the fabric of Port Charles like fire through dry brush. It wasn't simply a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was a brother turning against the man who once stood as an unshakable pillar in his family's foundation. It was one of the most shocking public betrayals the town had ever seen, and it triggered a sequence of events that none could have predicted. Lucas hadn't made the decision lightly. He had stood in the shadows for weeks, watching the man he loved, Marco Rios, drown beneath the sorrow of losing his mother. Lucas had tried to be the rock, the voice of reason, the shoulder to lean on. But the haunting look in Marco's eyes, the way he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe without collapsing into memories of Natalia, began to crush Lucas too. Then came the pieces. Quiet and fragmented at first, deleted surveillance footage from Charlie's pub, Natalia's last appointment cancelled abruptly, a voice memo hidden in her phone where she whispered about being followed. Threatened, afraid. Lucas had lived in the Corinthos orbit long enough to recognize the signs. And though every bone in his body begged him to keep the truth buried for the sake of his family, his conscience, sharpened by the anguish in Marco's every breath, would not let him stay silent. What made the revelation so devastating wasn't just the accusation itself, but who it came from. Lucas was not a stranger with an axe to grind. He was Carly's brother, Michael's uncle, a man who had shared holidays and heartbreaks with the Corinthos family. His word carried weight not because he was loud, but because he was trusted. And that trust, now transformed into a blade, cut deep. Carly's world tilted on its axis when she heard the words fall from her brother's lips. She tried to speak, to deny, to rationalize, but there was no escape from the tsunami of betrayal and disbelief. If Lucas believed Sonny was responsible, if Lucas, the one who had once defended Sonny in court and sheltered Donna from the fallout of Sonny's empire, believed this, then what did it mean for the rest of them? Sonny himself did not respond publicly at first. He disappeared into the silence, into the shadows that had always embraced him. But Port Charles erupted. Media outlets camped outside General Hospital, reporters shouted questions at anyone even loosely connected to the case. And protesters gathered outside the police station demanding a reopened investigation into Natalia's death. What had once been considered a tragic accident, a fatal mixture of prescription pills and alcohol, was now being recast as a targeted elimination. And suddenly, everyone remembered that Sonny had been one of the last people to see Natalia alive. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Christina, already reeling from her trauma at Charlie's pub, collapsed into tears upon hearing the news. She remembered the tension in her father's voice days before the incident, the way he gripped his phone like it was a weapon. The cold fury in his eyes when he spoke of people who asked too many questions. Michael, whose third-degree burns were a lingering reminder of the chaos that followed Sonny like a ghost, felt something twist and snap in his chest. For years he had tried to balance loyalty and morality, but now he saw the truth too clearly. The man who had raised him had become a storm, destroying everything in his path. Lucas, for his part, became a target. Old friends turned their backs, accusing him of betrayal, of selling out his family. Carly didn't speak to him for days. Bobby, heartbroken and torn between her children, avoided choosing a side. But Marco stood beside Lucas, his hand gripping Lucas's tighter with every news cycle. He didn't want revenge. He wanted closure. And Lucas, despite the venom thrown his way, had given him that. For Marco, the pain of losing his mother could never be erased, but knowing that someone cared enough to speak the truth, even at great personal cost, gave him a reason to breathe again. But Port Charles is a town of long memories and buried secrets, and nothing stays still for long. Within days, others began to step forward. A bartender from Charlie's pub admitted overhearing an argument between Sonny and Natalia, hushed, intense, filled with threats and veiled warnings. A former associate of Sonny's leaked documents showing money transfers and encrypted calls the week Natalia died. The DA reopened the case, and suddenly, Sonny found himself under formal investigation. The lines were drawn. Those who remained loyal to Sonny saw the investigation as a witch hunt, a calculated attack meant to destroy a misunderstood man. But for others, it was the long overdue reckoning of a man who had evaded justice for too long. For Lucas, the consequences were deeply personal. He lost his position at General Hospital when board members cited media distractions. He received anonymous threats. Donna, too young to understand, asked why Uncle Lucas didn't come around anymore. Carly, torn between her protective instincts as a mother and her need to understand the truth, finally confronted Lucas in private. She demanded answers, screamed, cried, but in the end, she heard the pain in her brother's voice and saw the devastation in his eyes. She realized that this wasn't about hatred. It was about loss. About justice. About the line between protecting the people you love and enabling them to destroy others. And Sonny, who had once stood atop Port Charles as an untouchable king, found himself increasingly isolated. The corridors of power he once walked without resistance now echoed with suspicion. His own allies began to question whether his silence was a calculated move or the mark of a man unraveling. There were whispers, rumors that Sonny had allowed Natalia's death because she had discovered too much about a pharmaceutical shipment routed through his shell companies. Others said it was personal, that Natalia had threatened to go public with information that could destroy Sonny's political allies and financial networks. The truth, perhaps, was somewhere in between. But in a town built on secrets, it no longer mattered. Perception had become reality. Lucas stayed in town despite it all. He walked through the glares, the murmurs, the cold shoulders. Because he knew the storm had to be weathered. He didn't regret what he'd done, though it had cost him everything. And in the quiet moments with Marco, when they sat together in the empty park where Natalia used to walk, he felt something like peace. Painful, yes. Lonely, always. But real. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to lie. Sometimes, standing in the fire is the only way to burn away the rot. And in the ashes of what once was, the shattered family dinners. The old loyalties, the unspoken pacts, Lucas found something stronger than blood, conviction. And Port Charles, forever changed, watched as one man's truth ignited a war no one could stop. The age of silence was over. The reckoning had begun. Lucas could feel it building like a storm beneath his skin, the unbearable pressure of knowledge unspoken. The weight of truth he had carried too long tearing at the seams of his composure as he stood at the precipice of a decision that would not only define his relationship with Carly forever but would so irrevocably alter the course of everything they both had built their lives upon. What had started as a vague unease in his gut had now evolved into a grim certainty that Sonny Corinthos, the man Carly had defended with unwavering loyalty for decades, was no longer merely the center of chaos but the epicenter of something darker, something dangerous. Something that had already taken one life and was on the brink of consuming more. Lucas had reached his limit. Natalia's death had initially been brushed aside as a tragic accident. A miscalculated mixture of alcohol and prescription pills, a woman overwhelmed by grief, confusion, or circumstance, but the deeper Lucas and Marco had looked, the more unsettling the picture became. And now Lucas was no longer willing to lie to himself or anyone else. He had seen the patterns, the timing, the silent gaps in the narrative, the inexplicable connections. And the sudden disappearance of surveillance footage from Charlie's pub just hours before Natalia's final moments. He had heard Marco's whispered fears in the dark. Had watched the man he loved break apart piece by piece as he tried to make sense of his mother's demise, and he had reached the painful conclusion that this was no coincidence, no accident. No random tragedy, it was a cover-up. And at the center of that cover-up, Lucas saw the figure who had loomed so large over all their lives for years, Sonny. Not because he had pulled the trigger or administered the poison, but because of what he knew, what he allowed, what he buried. Now, as Carly stood at the edge of yet another precipice, trying to shield herself from the inevitable wave of disaster approaching, Lucas knew he had to say what no one else would, do what no one else dared, warn her. But even as the words formed in his mind, he could see that look in Carly's eyes, the familiar, infuriating, heartbreaking loyalty that refused to die. That same blind commitment to Sonny that had led her into the fire more times than he could count, and he knew that the warning alone might not be enough. Because Carly didn't just love Sonny, she believed in him, clung to him like a lifeline even when the rope had frayed beyond repair, and even now, when everything around her screamed danger. She was still trying to convince herself that she could fix this, that she could save him. But what she didn't seem to understand, or refuse to admit, was that there was nothing left to save. The Sonny she knew had been eroded by years of war, by the lives he'd taken and the lies he'd told, by the kingdom he'd built on blood and silence. He was no longer a man on the edge. He was a man who had already fallen, dragging everyone close to him down with him. And Lucas couldn't stand by and watch his sister become the next casualty in a long line of broken lives left in Sonny's wake. So he told her the truth, not in whispers, not in riddles, but plainly. Firmly, without hesitation, walk away. Not later, not after one more favor, one more cover-up, one more desperate act of loyalty. Now. Because the investigation into Natalia's death was not going away. The whispers were turning into headlines, the private suspicions into formal inquiries. And Lucas knew it was only a matter of time before Sonny was dragged fully into the spotlight. And when that happened, anyone standing beside him would fall too. Carly, with all her connections. All her children, all her business dealings and her fragile attempts to keep her family intact, would become collateral damage, not because she was guilty, but because she was complicit by association. Lucas had seen it happen before, innocent people destroyed by proximity to Sonny's darkness, and he would not let it happen again. Not without trying to stop it. But what terrified him more than the chaos outside was the chaos within Carly. Because somewhere deep down, she was already trying to rationalize it. Lucas could see it in her hesitation, the way her jaw tightened, the way her gaze dropped just slightly, the way she didn't ask for proof but instead asked for time. She wasn't ready to leave Sonny. Not because she didn't believe Lucas, but because she didn't want to believe herself. She wanted to believe in the version of Sonny who had once protected her. Who had stood by her through loss and betrayal, who had cradled Donna and promised her safety. But that Sonny no longer existed. What stood in his place was a man too entangled in secrets to escape. A man whose silence about Natalia's final days was itself a condemnation. Lucas needed her to see that. He needed her to stop protecting Sonny and start protecting herself, her children, her future. Because the storm was coming. The media had caught wind of the inconsistencies. Reporters were already digging. The police had reopened files, subpoenaed footage, and now, all signs pointed toward a truth too ugly to ignore. And Lucas knew exactly how this would play out. Carly would stay silent too long. She would stand by Sonny until the last possible moment. And by the time she realized she was standing on sinking ground, it would be too late. The legal system would come for Sonny, yes, but it would also come for anyone suspected of aiding or abetting. For anyone who knew the truth and said nothing. And when that happened, Donna would ask why her mother was in courtrooms instead of classrooms, why their home was filled with fear instead of laughter. And Carly would have no answer. Lucas couldn't bear the thought. Not again. Not after everything. So he spoke with the kind of brutal honesty that only someone who loves you enough to let you hate them can summon. He didn't care if it ended their relationship. He didn't care if she turned away and slammed the door. He just needed her to hear it. Because beneath all the politics and the spin and the denials, the truth was simple. Carly was standing too close to a man on fire. And if she didn't move now, she would burn too. The tragedy wasn't just Natalia's death. It was the failure to learn from it. It was the looming realization that nothing Carly could do would fix this, not her cleverness, not her charm, not her fierce determination. Sometimes, saving someone meant walking away. Sometimes, love meant letting go. And Lucas, exhausted and resolute, understood that more clearly than ever. He had chosen truth, chosen Marco, chosen the chance to stop the cycle, and now, all he could do was hope that Carly would do the same before the flames swallowed her whole. Lucas had never spoken with such severity before, never allowed his voice to carry the sharp, controlled menace of a man who had witnessed too much and lost more than he could articulate, but now, standing inches from Carly in a room heavy with tension and unspoken dread. He was no longer pleading, he was warning her, almost threatening her, not out of malice, but out of desperation born from fear. His words came not as an emotional outburst but as a calculated and icy message. One meant to penetrate the armor of defiance that Carly had always wrapped around herself whenever Sonny's name was invoked. But this time, it wasn't just about loyalty or pride. This time, it was about survival. Lucas wasn't warning her because he wanted to hurt her, he was threatening her because she refused to understand that the danger was no longer abstract, no longer distant, and no longer avoidable. The moment she kept choosing to tether herself to Sonny was the moment she invited chaos, legal peril, and possibly even violence into her life, into Donna's life. Into the lives of everyone who still tried to protect her. And Lucas had had enough. He had watched Carly continue to protect Sonny, to speak for him, to clean up after him as if her effort alone could erase the blood on his hands. But Lucas knew what she refused to accept, that Sonny was past the point of saving. That his involvement in Natalia's death wasn't some unfortunate coincidence or a misunderstanding, but a symptom of a man who had allowed power to consume him until there was no distinction left between defense and destruction. Lucas stood his ground, his voice unwavering, telling Carly that if she didn't step away, she would be swallowed by the same fire that had destroyed Natalia. He told her that whatever she thought she owed Sonny, it would never be worth the price of what was coming next. Because things were escalating. Fast. The whispers in the corridors of the hospital, the slow, subtle glances exchanged in police precinct hallways, the redacted reports, the files suddenly reopened, the press beginning to circle, it was all converging. And Lucas, with a clarity born from trauma, could feel the inevitable collapse drawing closer. But what haunted him most wasn't the legal fallout, or even the moral disgrace, it was the possibility that Carly didn't care, or worse, that she believed she was untouchable. That stubborn belief, that deep-rooted illusion that she could control the narrative, that she could outsmart the destruction that followed Sonny like a shadow, was now becoming the greatest threat to her own life. Because this time, there would be no cover, no shield, no plausible deniability. If she stayed, she would be implicated. She would be named. She would be buried. The madness of her refusal to let go began to consume Lucas. Every moment she clung tighter to Sonny, every time she dismissed the warnings as exaggerations, as paranoia, was a moment that confirmed to Lucas that she had crossed into delusion. This was no longer loyalty, it was obsession, dangerous and destructive. It was Carly against the world. Convinced that she alone could carry Sonny through the storm, even as the world crumbled beneath her feet. Lucas saw it in her eyes, the twitch of denial, the defensive anger. The fragile belief that if she just tried hard enough, Sonny would come back from the edge. But Sonny was already gone. And Carly was running headlong toward the same fate if she didn't stop. The danger wasn't hypothetical. It was real. Tangible. There were people whispering about retaliation, about silencing witnesses, about tying up loose ends. Lucas had heard enough to know that Carly wasn't just protecting a criminal, she was becoming a liability to the people who still worked in Sonny's shadows. And liabilities didn't last long in Sonny's world, not when his empire began to shake. The people who had once smiled at Carly, thanked her for her discretion, would be the same people who erased her if they thought she might say too much, ask too many questions, or refuse to walk away when told. Lucas didn't want to scare her, but he needed her to be scared. She had to be. Because this wasn't a soap opera or another courtroom war she could wiggle out of. This was real, it was dark, and it was closing in fast. And still, Carly resisted. Still. She looked at Lucas with disbelief, as if he were the traitor, the one who didn't understand what family meant. But Lucas did understand. That was why he was standing there, shaking. Eyes wild with the ache of watching someone he loved spiral into something so recklessly self-destructive. He remembered the nights holding Marco. The tremors in Marco's hands as he replayed the last call from his mother, the guilt, the unanswered questions, the lingering dread. Lucas had chosen to speak the truth about Sonny. To rip open the silence and let the rot spill out, and now he needed Carly to do the same. He needed her to choose herself. But her silence, her refusal to walk away, was confirmation of something far more disturbing, that she would rather burn with Sonny than walk alone. Lucas told her she had a choice. Not because he wanted to hurt her, but because he knew the pain that was coming would be far worse if she stayed. He told her that this wasn't about family anymore. It was about complicity. And the authorities weren't going to see her as a grieving ex-wife, they were going to see her as someone who obstructed justice, who used her influence to bury evidence. Who knew too much and said too little. And they would not show mercy. Not this time. Lucas had already seen the wheels turning. The ADA was watching her. The police were reviewing transcripts of her visits. Her name had appeared in sealed documents. It was already too close. And yet, the true terror, the most maddening, unbearable thing, was that Carly still believed she was doing the right thing. That clinging to Sonny, defending him, covering for him, was somehow noble. But there was nothing noble about sacrificing yourself for someone who wouldn't do the same for you. There was nothing righteous about protecting a man who had made peace with the idea of letting others fall so he could stand. Lucas was done begging. He was done sugarcoating. He made it clear that if she didn't step away, she would not only lose her freedom, her family, her identity, she might lose her life. Because the kind of people who were circling now weren't the usual enemies. They were internal. Operatives. Insiders. They wouldn't send warnings. They would act. And Lucas would not watch his sister become another name in a file, another picture on the news. Another whispered cautionary tale of what happened when you stood too close to Sonny Corinthos for too long. Carly's stubbornness was no longer strength. It was delusion. It was denial. It was the final mistake before everything crashed down. And Lucas, voice low and cold and terrifying in its calm, let her know, this was not just a warning. It was the last time he would try to save her. After this, she was on her own. And when the fall came, and it would come, there would be no one left to catch her.